everyone, good morning. Thanks for joining us for our newest webinar, JIRA Administrators Primer. We're recording this session and we'll submit a link to the recording over the next few days. Just a heads up, our next webinar, the JIRA Fundamentals Primer, is going to be scheduled for October 1st at 11 a.m. Central. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and provide them via the questions utility in the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll go ahead and queue them up and answer them towards the end of the session. So on the webinar today from Precipio Consulting, we have Christopher Pepe. Chris is one of our partners here, and he's our resident Atlassian guru who, among a variety of interests, enjoys integrating JIRA in unexpected ways. He's done everything from making JIRA pour beer to making toast, and will be presenting today's webinar. My name is Shayla Sander. I'm a business development manager for Precipio Consulting, and I'll be serving as a moderator for this webinar. We've been Atlassian experts for over 5 years now and are one of 4 platinum enterprise experts in the country. Close to 100% of our projects are Atlassian related, and we have over 100 clients across the US, ranging in size from small 20-person companies to Fortune 20 enterprises across many different industries. We help our clients with process-centric technology solutions that facilitate traditional business process management, IT service management based on ITIL, and software development life cycles. In the SDLC space, we're helping clients transition from waterfall to agile. Whatever widgets you produce, we help improve the quality and throughput at the lowest cost. We support our clients in all facets of the Atlassian product suite and build methodologies and solutions across the entire line of products. This includes best practice advice and guidance, solutions architecting and implementation, licensing, installs, upgrades, and maintenance, hosting and managed services, and of course, training. So now let's go ahead and turn things over to Chris to lead us through today's webinar.
Thanks, Shayla. So thanks for joining us today. We've got a good little bit of content put together for you that we're going to talk through today. We're going to start off looking at project configuration because that's really the vast majority of what people actually care about as JIRA administrators and as users of JIRA. You don't really have a project, you don't really configure your project, then what really are you doing in the tool? There's actually a lot of kind of best practices that we're going to try to talk through, but one of the most important ones is effectively building screens. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on that. We're also really going to talk about improving end user experience. That overall user experience is really going to drive adoption rates, how people feel about the tool. You know, it's kind of something we never really used to pay a lot of attention to, but we're paying a lot more attention to these days. Because while user experience just seems like it's, you know, a nice little candy coating on a tool, it actually really drives people's happiness, and their happiness ultimately is going to drive the quality of the work that they're going to do. Since the kind of second half of JIRA that we're using it for is reporting and metrics and data mining, we really want high quality data to go into the system so that then later when we draw conclusions from it, they actually have some bearing on reality. We're going to move away from the project configuration space a little bit and talk a little bit about maintenance of the application and some of the other kind of system administration side of things. There's actually going to be a little bit of demo kind of sprinkled throughout, and we have quite a bit of time today, so anything that you want to see, please ask for questions, and we'll get through as much of that as we possibly can. So let's start off with project configuration. Like I said before, it's really all going to be about the schemes, the actual kind of project definition that you create. That's going to drive how your project operates and what people are going to use it for. There are a handful of other important aspects of the project itself that we're going to talk through as well. So versions and components are pretty simple concepts, but they're pretty important parts of the project itself. And they really give us additional layers of hierarchy, ways of organizing our data within the project. And then lastly, we're going to talk about roles because they're a little bit abstract and they're a little bit confusing to a lot of new JIRA administrators. So we'll spend a minute on that. So schemes are really the backbone of your project configuration. They allow you to reuse a lot of your project definitions, a lot of your project configuration options as well. The schemes are ultimately the things that you have to create in order to configure your JIRA project to do what you want it to do. So here I've got a little screenshot. We'll jump over to JIRA for a second just to take a look at schemes as well. But here we can see three of the first schemes you configure: the issue type scheme, the workflow scheme, and the screen scheme. It's actually, for screens, it's actually an issue type screen scheme, just to further confuse things. But for the issue types, you can have any number of issue types within JIRA. Everything is called an issue, and while issue sounds like a negative thing, issue types themselves can really track anything. Anything from assets to human resource records, bugs, stories. What you see here is from a software development project, an agile project. So you see very agile terms: story, bug, epic, improvement, technical task, or some kind of subtask. Those are the issue types that are valid for this project. And then under the workflows, we have our development workflow scheme, which it's a little bit different these days, but if you remember the way the JIRA used to work a while ago, was that the JIRA default workflow out of the box had a condition on it that only the assignee was allowed to start and stop progress. That was something that didn't work that well for us. So I copied it and removed those conditions, and I always called it JIRA sans condition. That just meant that anybody was allowed to start and stop progress. But that's the workflow that we're using there. And then underneath the screens, I've got my development screen, which is wrapped up into a development screen scheme, which is then configured into our development issue type screen scheme. One of the first best practices that I'll highlight right here is that you notice that I created a project definition. I think we're going to talk about this again in a little while, but I created a project definition around software development projects. Our agile software development projects have certain issue types that are associated with them, certain workflows that we use, certain metrics that we want to track, so fields that we put onto screens. So I created all of these definitions, and I named them development issue type, screen scheme, workflow scheme, and issue type scheme. That way, when I go to create a new software development project, all I have to do is go grab all of my development schemes and map them to that project, and it'll work exactly the same way as all of our other software development projects work. That reusability makes it a lot easier for us to spin up similar type projects. And then as my developers move from team to team or from project to project, they know exactly the way that project is going to work, because it works like every other project that we run. There's no special cases. There's nothing different about it. They're going to run the exact same processes. So here we are back over into JIRA, looking at that same project. So there's the workflows and the screens we're looking at. There's also field configurations. There are notification and permission schemes. We're going to talk about roles, components, and versions separately, so I'll save that for a minute. But to configure this project, if this was a new project, I really just have to go down this left-hand side and click through each of these things and make sure that I choose the development scheme that's associated with the right configuration element. So versions allow us to track things over time. It really allows us to take our entire project and iterate over time. This is primarily going to be used for releases or new versions of your application. Historically, we would have used it for sprints as well, because we didn't have another way of tracking sprints back when Agile for JIRA was called Greenhopper. But nowadays, sprints are actually their own thing, so we don't have to do that anymore, at least. But anything that's going to change over time, iterate over time, but it's going to be the whole set, is really going to be tracked as a version. Anyone who's already a software development team should be relatively familiar with the concept of versions. And if you aren't developing software, then you just don't have to use them at all. Versions get applied to your fixed versions and your effects version. We don't see effects version used nearly as much, even for bugs, but we do see it used a bit. Fixed version is really ultimately where you're going to put things. So to build your roadmap, for instance, you're going to associate your JIRA issue with a particular fixed version. So here we've got 0.2 and 0.3. I could go add another version, 1.0, and say that's going to be, August of 2016. We're not even really thinking about it yet, but we know we're going to do it eventually. We have this whole backlog of issues that we want to work on. stuff that we're going to do, but we're not going to worry about it for a while, I'll just go stuff that off into 1.0, and we'll let that be next year's problem. Versus things that we're going to fix immediately, I'll put them into the newer versions. And that lets me start to build up that roadmap. So the versions are going to allow us to historically track when did we actually release a particular feature, when did something actually go out into production, as well as start to do some of that road mapping and some of that planning out into the future. So as a project administrator, you can create versions. They have names and descriptions, start dates, and target release dates. And then from there, they go and get released. So a version can be released or unreleased, archived, and overdue. Think of the various states that a version can exist in. And we can see that one of them is showing up as red. It's because that one was supposed to be released on time and wasn't. That varies from components, where components are really just a kind of smaller bucket within your project to put issues into. So this allows us to take the overall project and break it down into smaller and smaller pieces. So here we have anything in this project that relates to Confluence in particular that can go into its own category, its own component. And we have a component lead of administrator on that. And we'll look at the other two, being hardware and intranet. Evan is the lead on that. In all of those cases, one of them is using the project default. The other two are using the component lead. So if I create an issue that's a hardware problem with the actual PCB that's inside our server that we're running, because we're Facebook and we make our own highly optimized servers. If there's a problem with one of the chips on there, I could create a JIRA issue, say this is a hardware problem, we need to fix this particular hardware problem. That's going to automatically get assigned to Evan if we use the automatic assignment engine within JIRA. So components allow you to break up your project into smaller pieces. It also allows you to make different team members responsible for that smaller part of the project. So again, as a project administrator, you have the ability to create these components and configure how they operate. The roles are the last special piece of project configuration that I wanted to talk about in this section. And really what just makes them confusing is they're another layer of abstraction. We're already used to the concept of users. We have people that have usernames and stuff associated to their user account, and they do stuff in the system. And we want a real user to have permission to do some things and not have permission to do other things. So the next thing that we do is we take those people and we put them into groups. Now that we have groups, we can say, okay, if you're a JIRA developer, if you're in that group, then you're allowed to do this stuff. If you're in the JIRA users group, you're allowed to do this other stuff. The problem with that is it doesn't allow us to make a reusable permission scheme. It doesn't allow us to create that definition of how does a software project behave versus how does a service desk project behave. They may have entirely different permission schemes, but we want all of our software development projects to have the same general permissions. We want the people that are doing things to be able to do the same things just in their project, not in my project. So roles really give us that extra layer of abstraction that allow us to create that definition. So here in the screenshots that I have on the right-hand side, I've got a little snippet of the permission scheme. Really, roles are only useful if you're coupling them with permission schemes. That's like 75% true, but for the most part, that's where you're going to be using it. So here we have two different permissions, the ability to create an issue and the ability to edit an issue. And we see in our permission scheme that the ability to create issues is granted to the role of users, whereas the ability to edit issues is granted to the role of developers. So let's take a look at that developer role. So I have two different projects. I have a Spacely Sprockets project and Expense-A-Go-Go Service Desk. These are both just projects out of our demo instance, which you've probably seen in past webinars that we've done. So in those two projects, the role of developers actually have very different user bases. So in the Spacely Sprockets project, Amanda, Cosmo, and Mom are all developers, versus in Expense-A-Go-Go, Charles Wells and Evan are the developers. In each of those projects, those developers are allowed to edit issues, but Amanda is not allowed to edit issues in Expense-A-Go-Go because she's not a developer in that project. Similarly, Charles isn't allowed to edit issues in the Spacely Sprockets project because he's not a developer in that. So roles allow us to have a single permission scheme that defines how all of our development projects work, or how all of our projects just in general work. In this case, we have the default permission scheme, which we've applied to all of our projects. And then in the actual individual projects, those roles can map down to individual users, either through groups or directly as users. Because as you've seen for roles, you can provision individual users or groups to a particular role. So hopefully that cleared it up a little bit. Next, we want to start thinking about our screens themselves. So we have our JIRA projects. We know that JIRA is an excellent tool for tracking information as something moves through its life cycle. And there are some natural tendencies to misuse or abuse the ability to track information, and it ends up hurting us in the end. Things that seem like they would help don't. So we're going to talk through that just a little bit. First off, let's start with some context. Where are screens actually used within JIRA? One of the places that they're used are in JIRA issue operations. So let's look at what those issue operations actually are and understand what the differences between them are. Then finally, let's go look at constructing screens so that we can create screens intelligently. So screens are really used in two places. They're used in workflow transitions, and they're used in these issue operations that I just alluded to. So a transition screen is when you're moving through your workflow from one state to another state, or one status to another status. These are screens that will pop up and prompt you for more information. So you should have all seen this at the very least in your very first JIRA project. When you resolve an issue or close an issue, the resolve issue screen pops up and it asks you for a resolution, to change the assignee, to log work against a ticket, and to comment on it. That's a transition screen. Transition screens usually have just a couple of fields on them, and they always have that comment box. So if you create a transition screen that doesn't have any fields on it, just a comment box will pop up. That differs from issue operations, which are creating, editing, and viewing, which we'll look at in just a second. These are the screens that pop up when you want to create a new issue, or when you're editing an existing issue, or when you're viewing an existing issue. And these typically have a lot more fields on them. They're going to have all the different data points that you want to track for that particular issue type. So whereas on the resolution screen, we really just need to know what's the resolution, and then we added some other stuff in there for fun. When you go to create an issue, you need to know the summary, who it should be assigned to potentially, who the reporter is potentially, the description, the environment, all those kind of base fields that come with JIRA, as well as all the different custom fields that we've created. You know, which data center does this affect, or whatever the other metrics that we need to track are. All of those need to be on the screen in order for it to show up for somebody to fill them out. So anything that you want people, anything that people should know when they create a new issue in the system should be on the create screen. So I said that there are a number of operations. There's creating, editing, and viewing. Creating, you definitely know. You've probably edited an issue at some point in your JIRA career as well. So that's when you click on the edit button and the pop-up screen shows up, and it shows you all the different fields in that JIRA issue. So you can edit or update a bunch of values at once. You can also inline edit things, but that's out of the context of JIRA issue operations. That's kind of a special case. And then lastly is viewing. And this is one that's not necessarily as intuitive. When you create an edit or a create screen, it makes sense because you put the issues in an order and they show up just like that in the screen. But the view screen is actually a screen in JIRA as well. Just the JIRA issue view is organized in a very particular way so that the main details go at the top and the users and the dates go off on the right-hand side. And all of those web panels arrange themselves as necessary. We can still control which fields are going to be displayed on that view screen. And we have creating, editing, and viewing as 3 different operations, which means that we can create screens for each of those different things. It's less common. The easiest case, and certainly the kind of first out-of-the-box case that you're going to use, is you create one screen. I have that development screen, and that's used for creating, editing, and viewing, which is my screen scheme. But a more complicated case might be you don't know everything when you create an issue. You know, maybe I have a help request that I want to put in, but there's some additional discovery that needs to be done. Or in the case of a bug, maybe the steps to reproduce. I guess I really should know that when I create it, but let's pretend for some reason we don't. I'm an end user and I'm not responsible for all the QA kind of stuff. I just said when I click over here, the thing doesn't work. So I want to create a bug report. I may not know those steps to reproduce, or you may not want to expose that to your users who are creating the issues, whereas your QA people may be going through and updating those issues. So the create screen may omit this steps to reproduce field. And you pick that up somewhere along the way in a transition screen. So when you go from triage to, yes, it's a real bug, a screen pops up that says steps to reproduce, and you put in the steps to reproduce at that point. Well, you may want to be able to change those at some point in the future, or edit them or update them to add more information. So steps to reproduce would be a good field to have on your edit screen. So even though it's not on the create screen, we now need to create a second screen for editing that contains our steps to reproduce. You could come up with a case for the view screen not including some of those fields as well, but in general, your edit screen and view screen are probably going to be the same, because if it's an editable field that you can set a value for, you probably want to be able to display that in JIRA as well. The only case where you'd have a view screen that didn't contain something that was on the create or edit screen is if you wanted to be able to set an attribute but not have people see it. I don't think that that's going to hide it from them entirely. It's still searchable by JQL, which it would have to be, otherwise there's no justification for having a field. If you're not going to look at the thing somewhere and or report off of it, there's no reason to have that field. But they could also modify that value using the bulk change feature in the issue navigator. So just because something is not on an edit screen or on a view screen doesn't mean that people can't change it. So just watch out for that. So now we understand what screens are and where they're used. Now we need to start thinking about what should go onto a screen. And this is by no means necessarily a perfect example of one, but this is just what the screen editor looks like. Actually, let's go ahead and jump over into JIRA and drill down into our development screen here. So here I'll click into our screen scheme. And you can see that for my issue operation, I just choose the default and I use the development screen for all of that. If I wanted to associate a different issue operation to a different screen, I can choose creating, editing, and viewing, and then I can choose from amongst all of our screens. Because I'm just using this one screen for everything, which is the simplest case and the easiest for us to do in this project, all I have to do is go look at this one screen. And we can see all the different fields that are on here. This is probably about as long as I would like a screen to be. And actually, this support customer, this is shared by 3 projects. I would like to remove this because the secure content project that I am managing, we don't use this field. So I hate seeing it there. But this is also shared by some other projects. So I should look at what those projects are. All right, Precipio development, I run that too. I run all these projects, so that's fine. In each of those cases, well, actually, that's not true, is it? One of them actually does have a support customer, so I can't go remove it. But what I can do is I'm going to move it down to the bottom because it's only used in one case. So I'm going to move that down to the bottom so I can ignore it. If I want to add another field, what don't we have on here? If I want to add a field, the interface is really easy these days. You just start typing, it's going to show you the things. You click on it, it's going to go to the bottom of the list, and then you can just drag it around. I don't actually want due date because we don't track things with dates in this particular project, so I'm going to remove that as well. But when you look at your screen, you want to start to think about what is the flow. When someone goes to create a new issue, they're going to see all of these fields in exactly this order. So you want them to be in a logical order so that they can start at the top and go down. Here we have our 2 epic things together, our epic name and our epic link. If I had the epic link, jumped in the middle on me. If I have the epic link down here somewhere and the epic name up there, and those are both things I want people to fill out, it's kind of, it doesn't really flow all that nicely because I go and I think about my epic and I put in my epic name. Then I go and put in the summary and the assignee and I'm thinking about this issue. Then I get back down to an epic link down here. It's kind of like, what am I supposed to do with that? Similarly, you don't want to have too many fields. If you feel like you're starting to get too many fields, you can add an additional tab. And again, because I have to have this field over here, customer support, that I don't really want on here, but I need it for one project, maybe I can go stuff it onto a different tab. So you can start to think about things like that. There we go. So now it's at least not on my main screen. So when I go to create an issue in my other two projects, I at least don't see support customer. But when I'm in that third project that needs it, I can click over to this tab. In general, I like to avoid using tabs as much as possible because they're not really solving the problem of using less fields. They're just kind of moving them off somewhere. But they are very useful for that particular case where we want to put auxiliary information onto a different screen just so that the thing doesn't scroll on forever. But that was the main point that I wanted to talk to, is that less is more. The fewer data points that you're actually tracking, the more likely you are to get valid data from people. The more likely that it is to be accurate, the more likely that people are to be happy, they won't complain about the tool, and the easier it is going to be to use as well as to track. Once you have too many metrics, it becomes difficult to track all of these things, because don't forget that you need to report off of all of this stuff. If you're not reporting off of it, you have to question, why did you have somebody fill it out in the first place? Because as a developer, I don't care about most of those fields. I just want to go do my work. So unless my boss is looking at it, why is it there? And that's, I think, the question that a lot of people don't ask themselves before they go add fields. I think we're gonna come back to that. So I'll save that little rant for later. So really, improving that user experience, designing screens is one part of it, designing workflows, all that other stuff. We really want to think about the quality of the information that's going into the system, how efficient it is to use. Atlassian uses this term of friction, which I think is a really good one. The more friction that you create, the more difficult you make it for people to do stuff, the more likely they are to try to find a way to circumvent the system. All right, if you think about water flowing down a river, if you put a dam in the way, it's just going to build up until it finds a way to go around it. So we need systems. We need to be able to track our processes. We want to have good data. We want to be able to report off of it. So you really want to design that user experience so that it's as positive and beneficial as possible. So people are happy about using the tool and they feel like it improves their job and lets them do a better job at producing quality work, as opposed to it's yet another thing I got to go fill out. And that's really where improving end user experience, that's really where the value comes from. So we're going to do that by looking at project administration best practices. We've already started talking about the best use of fields, but I want to go off on another little tangent on that. And then we're going to talk about the qualities of efficient workflows. So what can you do to make your workflows more efficient? So really for projects and everything else, keep it simple really is the best advice. Apple does a really good job of this, and they're quite famous for making their products simple to use, easy to use. They're still powerful. They're still very valuable. They still do a lot of really great things. They're just not complicated. I came from an engineering background, and because of that, the tools that I always built were infinitely configurable, infinitely flexible to the end user, but impossible to use and completely undocumented and ugly. And that's very, very typical of our kind of last generation of tools. And really, honestly, a lot of tools these days, there are still a lot of products that are out there that are very, very versatile. You can do whatever you want as an end user, but it's impossible to figure out how to do anything in them. And in some ways, maybe you could argue that JIRA is that way because it's also infinitely configurable, but that's your problem because you're a sysadmin, you have to learn more stuff. But really, in general, the administration experience in JIRA these days is pretty simple. There's really good documentation, and there's a lot of resources available to you to get the most out of it. One of the things you can do as a system administrator that's going to make managing JIRA a lot easier for you is also simplify it. So do things like create project definitions as opposed to letting every project do whatever it wants and every project manager do whatever they want. Sorry, project managers. We're moving a little bit more into the kind of JIRA administrative role. And my number one project best practice beyond simplify is don't give out the keys to the castle to anybody. But we'll get to that as well. So keeping the project simple for end users to use is going to make their life a lot better. Keeping the project configuration simple is going to make your life a lot better as an administrator. That goes back again towards create types of projects, have standard definitions so that people know, regardless of what team they're on, people are going to move around your organization a lot. You're going to be constantly onboarding new people as well. So have a standard way of doing things. That way everybody knows what they're supposed to do. They know what the process is. I can't tell you how many projects we do with people where we develop these wonderful solutions, these amazing, beautiful solutions, but then they don't properly communicate that to their people. And if people don't know what to do, then that wonderful, beautiful process isn't going to do any good because no one knows what they're actually supposed to do in it. That training piece, after you've developed your definitions, is almost more important than having a good process in the first place. People have to know how to use the tools. That comes through standardization and through documentation. Documentation is another one of those best things that you can do for people. Onboarding is difficult. People jumping from teams to team is difficult. You want to put them through some more formal training process, but you want to allow them to self-serve as well. So have all your documentation in Confluence or whatever you do for your documentation. Make it so that it's easy to find, and make it so that it's up to date and accurate, so it accurately reflects the state of the system. As far as fields go, we talked about making screens that are streamlined, that kind of flow. So as you're going through creating an issue, as you're moving from thing to thing, it feels like the next field belongs. The other side of that is once you have your project definition set up and you're going along, you're going to say, oh, well, I need to know this other piece of information. Oh, I need to know this other piece of information. Oh, I need to know this other thing. And there's this really strong tendency, not just with JIRA, but with every tool that allows you to create custom fields, to create as many as possible. There's this belief out there in the world that the more data that you capture, the more you're going to be able to mine that data, and the richer the conclusions you're going to be able to draw from it. But the reality of it is that with every new field that you add, that's one more thing that you're asking people to do. And as that grows over time, that makes it less and less likely that they're actually going to put valid, rich information in there. And it makes it less and less likely that you're going to accurately report off of it. So you're getting much lower quality data being put into the system and a increased or a decreased ability to report off of it. So the reports that you get aren't going to actually tell you anything. Where you wanted to put all these fields in there so that you would have richer data and be able to draw stronger conclusions, you're actually going to end up with much lower quality data that's going to give you very fuzzy conclusions. You're not going to be able to definitively say, yes, this is actually a trend that's happening. There's also a really strong desire to make fields required so that people have to fill them out, and that's going to lead to exactly that same problem. That if you don't give people a don't know type option, then they're going to have to put something in, and if they don't know what they're supposed to put in, then they're just going to pick some random thing, which means that random thing is now completely wrong, so any conclusion that you draw off of that is wrong. So whenever you're going to add a new field to the system, you want to make sure that there's actually a justification for taking on that added cost, both administratively and on the user side. But considering that real cost of adding a new field to the system, you're asking users to add more things, you're asking administrators to keep track of more things, and you're asking managers to report off of more things. So the less data that you capture, the richer the data you're actually going to have this. Now, of course, there's a balance there. If you don't capture any data, then you can't draw any conclusions. But if you capture too much, you're in the same boat. So you really have to figure out where that sweet spot is for your organization. And as far as your workflows themselves go, this is another place where less is going to be more. Especially as we see more and more people moving towards agile methodologies or agile frameworks. Which one is it? I always forget now. As people move towards agile, we see people moving towards less restrictive workflows and fewer steps in the workflow. Really, you care about your definition of what's to do and maybe the backlog before that. So if you're going to run Scrum, you're going to have a product backlog, and you're going to have a sprint backlog once you actually are in a sprint. So maybe you care about those two particular backlogs. You're going to have some level of in progress, And that can be a number of steps. It can be, development, QA work, or whatever you do for that. And then finally, you have some definition of done. So in a lot of cases, we have the JIRA open and reopened as your definition of to do. And if it happens to be in a sprint, then it's in the sprint backlog. Otherwise, it's the product backlog. In progress is things that you're working on. Resolved is things that are ready for testing or ready for QA. And then closed is development's done, ready to ship, the branch has been merged. Even longer waterfall workflows still can be very streamlined. So just because you have 10 or 15 steps in your life cycle doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. Where it starts to become a bad thing is when there are convoluted little branches or little offshoots in the workflow, or if you are adding additional complexity to try to meet some business goal, which is really just making it a lot harder to use the system. When you look at an issue in JIRA and there's 10 different transition links that you can click on, it's very difficult to know what you're actually supposed to do in that situation or why you would click on one button versus another button. So you really want to make it so that the workflow is, it's obvious how work is supposed to flow through that workflow. This one's not particularly difficult, but you really don't want to ever have a status that you can get into that you can't get out of. This is mostly something to watch out for while you're developing a new workflow or where you're changing one of your existing workflows if you publish it prematurely or something like that. And we have plenty of cases, especially in compliance situations, where once an issue or an incident has been closed, it can never be opened again. So if that incident crops up again, they need to create a new issue and run that through the life cycle again. That's just fine. You don't have to necessarily have every closed status have a reopen transition out of it. But in general, you don't want issues to ever get stuck somewhere to where no one can ever do anything to them again. So in the vast majority of business cases, being able to reopen a closed issue is usually a beneficial thing. It also adds a lot of value to the workflow because it allows you to be able to go and look for places where you had to do rework. Anytime an issue was closed and is now open, that's a case where something went wrong. The process failed. So you want to figure out what failed in that process so that we can fix our process so that that doesn't happen again. With workflows, you want to test and test and test and test. If you are a new JIRA administrator, you may even want to develop your workflows in your test system. I've made a claim for a while now, and I haven't actually checked on it for a while, so I'm going to give you this word of warning, and I'm going to give it with the caveat that it may be totally untrue. But at least historically, so JIRA has this relatively new feature in the last couple of years where you can take a workflow and export it as a workflow bundle. You can then take that bundle and import it into a different instance of JIRA, which is awesome because that means that you can develop a workflow in your test system completely isolated from production, not affecting anybody. You can develop that workflow in your test system and then export it as a bundle and import it into JIRA, and it works great. The challenge that we had with it historically is the things that didn't transfer over were conditions, post functions, and validators from third-party plugins, from non-Atlassian plugins, or Atlassian plugins that you got off the marketplace. And that's really a lot of what we do. A lot of the process enforcement that we do is using a lot of these third-party add-ons to get special conditions and validators. And those workflow bundles weren't transferring them over. So it's one thing to watch out for, is that may not work effectively. But that may have also been fixed by now as well. But developing things in your test system is always the best way to go. It's just with JIRA workflows that guarantees that you're duplicating that data, because other than the workflow bundle method, there's not really a great way to get things out of your test system into your production system, especially if they're not perfectly in sync. A lot of what we end up doing is we have test projects in our production instances. So if we're going to make changes to workflows, we make those in an isolated workflow and an isolated workflow scheme that we have associated to a test project. That allows us to fully test all of those changes before we apply them back to the production projects. Even after we have applied them to our production projects, we still take a test issue and go run through all the different changes that we made in that workflow to make sure everything is actually still working correctly. Because moving from project to project, things could change, different groups could be involved. Depending on how you actually set up those conditions, You could end up in a situation where you go roll things out into production thinking that everything is peachy, and now people are stuck and they can't actually do any work anymore. So you want to make sure that you test everything really, really heavily. I think there are a few other things, but I'll leave it at that for now. So let's talk a little bit about JIRA maintenance itself. There are a handful of things that I want to highlight, and I think there's a couple of off-slide things that I want to mention as well. The first is the Atlassian support tools. There are some really, really great tools already built into the system that you have at your disposal. So we'll take a look at that really quickly. We're going to talk about change management within JIRA itself. It's a production system, no different than any of your other production systems. You should have a change management process and follow it. There are some automated tools within JIRA, and I think we'll touch on monitoring and things like that a little bit there. And then just some insights and documentation. So the support tools within JIRA, if you're not aware of these, this is a really nice set of tools that you have built in. It allows you to create a support request directly with Atlassian. So because you own a JIRA license, you have the ability to create support requests and get support from Atlassian. In some cases, you may need to escalate, in which case, that's where Precipio can come in and help you work through that, give you a higher touch, whatever you end up needing. If you don't feel like you're getting it from Atlassian, that's where we can excel, or we can also be a little bit more invasive in your systems, because in a lot of cases, we're helping our clients work through incidents that they're having. So we already have access to their systems. We have the ability to VPN in. We can look at logs. We can look at monitoring systems and things like that Atlassian doesn't have access to. But once you're engaged in a support issue with Atlassian, they're going to repeatedly ask you to generate these support zips. Because they don't have direct access to your system, the support zip is a way for them to get deep, meaningful information as to what's happening within your system. So it's going to include your application logs, your application configuration files. It can take thread dumps. It'll do a number of other things. You have the option to pick which things you do and don't want them to get, so you don't have to send them things that you feel like are sensitive. But that's going to allow them to analyze your system from afar. Then there are a number of other things like the log scanner and the health check, which will automatically look through. So let's take the log scanner as the example. The health check does a slightly different thing, but it does the same sort of sanity check to make sure all of the entities within JIRA are properly linked together, and it will try to repair those. The log scanner will go through your JIRA logs, and it looks for warnings and severe and critical and errors and things like that. And it takes those error messages and it compares them to the JIRA knowledge base. And if there's a match, then it will suggest a link to you showing you this is a problem that you have. This is a known problem that has a known solution. Here's the first place you should start looking for how to resolve this issue. So log scanners are a really, really nice tool to help you start hunting down all of those little ghosts that are living in your system. And then system information is just a really important place to get all of your different system metrics. So if you don't know where your home directory is, that's in the system information. If you want to know what version of Java is JIRA currently running with, where's your database, how's your database connected, how much data do you have, how many attachments, how many projects, the number of issues that have been created. There's a ton of information that's in that system information. That's one of the first places that we go and look when we're helping somebody debug a system that we are unfamiliar with. So as far as change management goes, like I said, JIRA is no different than any of your other systems. You want to control change. This is one of the reasons that we recommend that people do not give out JIRA administration and system administrator access to the majority of their users. Really, the way that it should work is product owners should be the manager of their project. So they should be the project administrator for their projects. But then the ALM team or IT group or whoever is supporting JIRA as a platform, as an application, they should be the JIRA administrators and system administrators. Really only a handful of people should have access to JIRA and system administration. That's actually my next bullet, so I'll pull it up. Really very few people should actually have system administrator and JIRA administrator permissions. When that's not the case, things just spin out of control far too quickly. Really what you need to do is have very few people that can actually make the changes, but a lot of people that are allowed to request it. So as a project administrator, I can say, I want this change to my project. I would like my workflow to work this way. I want this new field added to my system or to my screens. And that way, you can then track those changes within JIRA. So you have a JIRA project, or if you track it some other way, that's fine as well. But a lot of times we end up doing this within JIRA. So I can create a ticket in JIRA that says, I want a new field that's called blah, and it has options A, B, and C. Now you have not only the ability to deny that request if it's something that you're just not going to support as a company. A field is a bad example of something you won't support as a company, but something like I want my own workflow, and you've decided, no, we're not going to do custom workflows. That allows you to have a conversation with that person to get justification for, well, why do you really need this? Is this actually the thing that you want, or what's the, as a JIRA system administrator, really ultimately what you're trying to figure out is what is the need that you have, what's the problem that you're trying to solve, and then hopefully you have the better knowledge of, well, we could solve it that way, but there's actually this better way that we could solve it. That's a lot of what Precipio does, is we know the ways to implement things. So if you can tell us what is that you're trying to do, we can help guide you through what's the best way to actually implement that. And as JIRA administrators, that's really the role that you're going to have to take on as well. So project administrators can ask you for things, you can talk about it, discuss it, come up with justifications, and then decide whether or not you're going to implement that change. In addition, now you have a record that says this was a decision that we made, this was who was involved in that decision, when we made it, and why we made that decision. So getting that change management process in place, as opposed to just allowing anybody to make whatever changes they want, is going to be very important. If you remember when we looked at JIRA, I wanted to go and change the screen, but then I noticed that it's shared with 3 other projects. So at the very least, if you're going to allow a bunch of people to make changes, make sure that they're aware that changes that they're making can potentially be impacting other projects. So if I went to my field configuration, for instance, and I made the component a required field, that means that everybody that uses that field configuration now has to fill in a component. And that could be other people's projects, which we don't want to be impacting. So if nothing else, if you're not going to take our advice of limiting the number of system administrators, at the very least make sure that everyone that has JIRA administration or system administration privileges is highly trained and understands the impact of the changes that they're making. Now, as far as JIRA checks go, we'll talk about the reindex in actually just a second. The integrity checker I actually already mentioned, and same thing with the log scanner. So the only one we didn't really talk about was the reindexing. You've probably noticed this little block pop up. Anytime you change anything administratively in JIRA, this little thing pops up that says that somebody made some change to something. In this case, Amanda changed custom fields at this point. So now it's recommended that we reindex. You will see this thing literally almost every time you go into the JIRA administration interface if you have more than one administrator. And really what JIRA is telling us is that, hey, everything that I do is driven by the index. All of these menus, everything that you see pop up, all this stuff comes out of the index. All the issues and everything else, everything comes out of the index. So if the index is out of sync with what's in the database, then you're not going to get the most up-to-date relevant information. Now, that doesn't mean that the world is going to stop. People's filters are still going to work just fine, and you're going to be able to search for information and find things. But there are some things that are missing. So whatever changes Amanda made to this custom field that she changed, that change isn't in the index, and that stuff isn't going to necessarily pop up. So if I'm trying to create a JQL filter and she added a new option to a select list, I'm not going to see that option as I'm typing things in. JQL won't suggest it to me automatically. I can remedy that by clicking on this indexing link or just going to System Index section. I think that's my password. All right. And then just going and running an index. Now, there's 2 different ways of doing it. Historically, there was only one way of doing it. You run the index, and what that does is stop the world. It locks JIRA. Nobody can do anything. They just get a screen that says JIRA's reindexing. Hang on a minute. So indexing used to be a bigger deal than it is now. The vast majority of you aren't going to have gigantic installations, so you can just do the background reindex, and that'll be fine. It runs a little bit slower, but it runs plenty fast enough. And it just runs in the background and does all the reindexing, and everybody can keep doing whatever they're doing. if you have a really large installation, or if you actually take regular maintenance windows to do things to JIRA, one of the things you can do is come in here and lock JIRA and rebuild the index. It'll go a lot faster doing it this way, but it will lock everybody out of JIRA. So you really should only do that in a planned maintenance window. There's also a new feature. I haven't used it a whole lot yet, so I won't speak too much about it. But there's this index recovery. One of the worst things that can happen is that your index will get corrupted. And once your index is corrupted, then nothing's going to work at all. So there are a handful of ways to recover it that are a little bit more painful. This allows you to back up an index at a certain point and then restore that, so you have less index to rebuild in the event that your index gets corrupt. But if you're looking for help, there are a ton of resources that are available to you. So the very first one that you might go to is answers.atlassian.com. That's what you see a screenshot of there. And this is Atlassian's question and answers forum, where you can go and see what other people have already had for challenges, look at what the solutions were, ask your own questions. This is a wonderful resource where there's a whole network of Atlassian expert groups like Precipio and other users of the tools that are all sharing information on challenges they've had, problems they've had, and helping each other solve each other's problems. So Atlassian Answers is a great place to go. There's also the JIRA Administrators Guide. So Atlassian has everything for all of their products, every version of all of them documented. So confluence.atlassian.com/JIRA, I think, is where you go for all the JIRA documentation. You just type into Google JIRA Administrators Guide and you'll jump right to it as well. So that shows you how to do everything click by click with screenshots, everything that you could do, everything there is to know about being a JIRA administrator. It's just a mountain of information to wade through, but it's all right there. There are also the Atlassian user groups. So Precipio is involved in a number of them in Texas, and we're always there, and we're always happy to hand out free advice. And there are Atlassian user groups all over the country and all over the world. So those are really great places to go and meet other people that are using the tools and get things that have worked for them and swap stories. There's also the Atlassian support. Like I mentioned, you have a license, you always have access to Atlassian's support team, so you can always reach out to them. And then there's always expert help. So anything that goes over and above what your team is either capable of or has bandwidth to do, you can always reach out to us to help you implement whatever you need to implement. We have a tremendous depth from very, very low level system administration all the way up through business process expertise. So regardless of what you're actually trying to implement with your Atlassian tools, we can help guide you through that successfully. As Shayla mentioned earlier, we're enterprise experts. We're platinum experts as well. This is a very small group of folks in the world that Atlassian has pegged to have the skill sets to be able to help kind of anybody, large or small, implement what it is that they need to implement. One of the things I actually wanted to mention a little while ago when we were talking about system administration stuff, and I only thought of it because we've been doing a lot more of it recently, is we've been doing a lot of stability assessments and things like that and helping people figure out why their instances of JIRA or Confluence or whatever aren't running as smoothly as they should be and giving them recommendations. One of the primary tools that we use has been New Relic, but there are a number of other JVM monitoring tools that are out there as well. And that's one of the best tools that you can implement that you don't have out of the box. The Atlassian logs are great, but there are a lot of cases where the logs are they're obfuscating the actual problem. You're getting error messages that aren't really pointing you back to the real root cause. They're just symptoms, and you're not really sure what's going on. Having JVM monitoring gives you a lot more insight as to what's actually happening within the JVM itself, so we can get a lot better system information. And then New Relic also provides a lot of really good kind of system monitoring, but there's a number of other system monitoring tools. A number of you probably already use Nagios. So with that, you can monitor whether the application's up, what the health of the server is, and you can actually write your own plugins for it as well to do everything under the sun. So you can monitor every aspect of the system and get a much better idea as to what's actually going on. It's going to allow you to preemptively discover problems and fix them before they actually cause outages. And in the event of outages, you're going to have much richer information to look for what was that root cause that caused this particular outage. So that's something we've been helping people do a lot of recently. And then lastly, I just wanted to kind of remind you again that everybody hates documentation. Nobody hates it more than engineers. But good up-to-date documentation that's easy to find and everybody knows where to get it. It's on the wiki. Everybody knows that. But make sure that it's actually easy to find and it's well organized and it's good, rich information that's going to be useful to technical and non-technical users. That's going to allow people to self-service. It's going to allow them to solve their own problems. It's going to allow them to figure out what it is they're missing. So at the very least, keeping those decisions that you made as to why you changed your process, at least keeping that well documented is going to help people figure out what's going on. But ideally, keep your actual processes documented. And if you want to get really crazy, have training videos and have lunch and learns and things like that so that people are always aware of what's going on. Provide information to people. It's going to make everybody a lot happier. I'm going to pull up the questions slide for the next few minutes.
Hey,
so we'll start doing questions and we'll go into the application demo. Anything? Go ahead, Shayla.
Sorry, we only had an hour slated for this webinar, but we do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Okay, so the first question, can you trigger reindexing via the API to use cron or another automated method?
That's a good question. I don't actually know the answer to that off the top of my head. Let's see if we can figure it out in just a second here, but we're pretty short on time, so I won't keep it too long. So you want to use the REST API most likely to do that. If not, the Bob Swift JIRA CLI would be the other thing to look at. So there is a reindex method. I'd want to go investigate this a little further before I start stop query index. I mean, it sure looks like you can.
Okay.
So this would be the REST resource.
Great, thanks. So the next one, how important is it to keep JIRA updated and how often should I update it?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, actually. That's a really difficult one, too. The answer is it depends. We worked with a medical device company that because of the way that they are regulated, they're not allowed to change tools, but like every 5 or 7 years or something crazy like that. So the version of JIRA that we implemented for them, that's what they're using for the next 7 years. That I wouldn't recommend doing if you could avoid it for any other thing. I would say basically stay up on at least the major version. So right now we're in the 6s, the 7s will come out next year sometime. So if you're not on JIRA 6 something, then get to that. And then other things like security advisories, especially if you run out on the public internet, if there's a security advisory that comes out, and especially if it's like an anonymous exploitable kind of thing, then you definitely want to upgrade to that particular version. But one of the things that's going to drive it is what add-ons you're using and what versions they're supporting, and any add-ons that you wrote yourself. That's going to be one of the things that's going to hold you back. But what that actual cadence should be is going to depend a little bit on your organization in particular. But at least stay up on the major version.
Okay, thanks. So the next one's about upgrading as well. How do you typically suggest upgrading the Atlassian product suite? Do you suggest having a non-production version of JIRA so you can test new versions first?
Absolutely. You should definitely have a test instance of JIRA, which you mirror your production instance into this test instance. Then go do that test upgrade. Verify that all of your add-ons still work, that people are still able to do all the things that they could do before. You're not getting exceptions in your logs. Now, if you're a really small organization, like for a long time, we actually didn't do that. I would just go in the middle of the night and upgrade JIRA. So regardless of how you're going to do it, you really should, especially if you're a large organization, you need to be doing it in a test environment before you do it in production. But whenever you get to production, you just want to make sure that you do it during a maintenance window. You lock everybody else out. So the best case is you are running JIRA through a proxy anyway. So you put up a maintenance screen so that anybody that's not in whatever IP block gets this maintenance screen and they can't get into JIRA no matter what. Shut down all your mail handlers and all that stuff. Take backups, database, home directory, application directory, then go do the upgrade. Because if something fails during the upgrade, the last situation that you want to end up in is that something's not working correctly and you can't roll back. You can only roll forward. When you upgrade JIRA, it actually changes your database, and a newer version of the database can't run with an older version of the application. So if you don't have a database snapshot to roll back to, you can't roll back and you can only roll forward. So you should definitely test, and have lots of backups.
Great, thanks. Still have quite a few questions. Let's see. Why can't you edit the username for JIRA on demand, but you can for the on-premise version?
Atlassian said so. The real answer is probably that it's because on-demand is backed by crowd. So you're not going to be allowed, and you're not given access to crowd through on-demand, so you're not allowed to change that. But that's just an implementation decision that Atlassian made for on-demand. It's because it's a slightly different version in JIRA.
Okay. The next one, please show again where you set a project's issue type scheme.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so let's go into the project itself. So within your JIRA administration, or from the project, actually, if you're a project administrator, if you go to the project, you'll have this administration tab over here. Stop that. Shoot. So if you click on administration, then you have all the different issue types that are here. I'm going to click on issue types. And over in the top right corner, which is usually where this action menu is, I can edit the issue types for this particular scheme, or I can choose a different scheme.
What tool did you use for VM monitoring?
Okay, well, so it'll depend a little bit on your infrastructure. So like, if you're running vSphere or something that's got its own set of tools, but so we use Nagios, we use OSSEC for intrusion detection, and New Relic is the it's a paid service, but New Relic is a really excellent tool that we highly recommend. So it's not just Atlassian related or JVM related. You can monitor just about anything with it, databases and all that stuff too. We're not really associated with them. That's just a free little plug for New Relic.
Okay, next question. Can you have nested groups in JIRA?
You can have nested groups. I don't think that JIRA itself will allow you to create nested groups, but you can do nested groups in a LDAP user directory, and JIRA will honor that. So Active Directory or something like that, you can set up nested groups and then configure JIRA to use nested groups in that user directory configuration.
Okay, next question. Can you allow third-party access to JIRA without giving edit rights?
Third-party what's now?
Third-party access.
So everybody that has access to JIRA has to be a named user. So you have to buy a seat for everybody that's going to log into it. So if you mean third-party access, meaning that like your clients can log into your JIRA instance, as long as they have web access to the user interface and a user account, then yes, they can log in.
Okay, we have two more questions. This one's a demonstration question. Can you demonstrate creating screen schemes and using them in a project?
Yeah. So here from my project, I'm going to click on screens. This is one of the more confusing things in JIRA administration, but you actually start off by creating custom fields, and then you put those fields onto a screen. Then with a screen, you associate that to actually we can see it pretty well here. So we created screens. So we created screens, and a screen is just a collection of fields. So these are all the different things I want to track, and I created a screen called development screen. I then created a screen scheme called development screen scheme, and I chose my development screen as the default screen for everything, so for creating, editing, and viewing. I then took my development screen scheme, and I associated that to my development issue type screen scheme. With the exception of this development screen scheme, anytime you see scheme in JIRA, what that means is you are mapping a issue type to a particular configuration item. So a workflow scheme maps your issue types to your workflows. A issue type screen scheme maps issue types to screen schemes, and screen schemes map issue operations to screens. Very confusing, I know. I'm going to go and edit this issue type screen scheme instead of creating a whole new one from scratch. So here we have our issue type screen scheme, which is the thing that I associate back to the project. And here I've got my default set to just use this for everything, but I can associate an issue type with a screen scheme. So let's say stories. We'll use our default screen scheme. So now we have, if I create a user story, it's going to use the default screen scheme. Everything else will use the development screen scheme. And then this default screen scheme in turn is going to use our default screen versus our development screen scheme, which uses our development screen for everything. So if I pull these two screens up side by side, we can see that the order of things is a little bit different, and like support customers is on the, what is this one, the default? Support customers on the default screen, and it's got a couple of extra tabs. So let me go create an issue. All right, so here if I choose a story, you can see that support customer shows up right here, because that was on that default screen that I associated in my issue type screen scheme. If I choose an epic, we'll see that the fields all jump around and that we no longer have that support customer showing up. That all happened because we used a screen scheme. We used a different screen scheme for stories as we used for everything else. And we did that in our issue type screen scheme. And because I want to reset this, because these are actual production projects, I'm just going to go and delete that. So we're no longer using the default screen scheme anymore. We're just using the development screen scheme. It's definitely confusing, I get it, but you put fields onto screens. You put screens into screen schemes, which tell which screen to use for creating, editing, and viewing issues. And you take screen schemes and you map them to issue types in an issue type screen scheme. Then you associate that whole mess to a project.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Okay, so this is the last question. Can you set the default value for a field in the Create Issue screen? For example, set fixed version to the highest value available.
Yep. So it's easiest to do with your custom fields. But here's a select list. Excellent. So here we have a number of, this is adaptability and some values related to it. There's no default value set, but I can choose a default value. So because none is set, none is what's going to automatically show up within JIRA. But if I go pick one, make that the default, then when you create a new issue, this is going to, average is going to automatically be the default value that gets set there. If you were able to do it with system fields, it would be in a field configuration. This one. So let's take priority, because that's a select list. I don't think you can do it with JIRA system fields. I might be wrong about that, but I don't know how to do it offhand. So you can only do it with custom fields as far as I know. Okay, great. So thanks for everybody for hanging out. I'm sorry I went long. I'll fix that next time. But just a real quick reminder before you go, our next webinar, JIRA Fundamentals Primer, is going to be hosted by Charles Wells. It's going to be on Wednesday, October 1st at 11 a.m. Central. And Charles teaches this class just about every day. He knows this inside and out. It's going to be a great webinar. So please sign up for that, or have your users sign up for it. Thanks so much for attending. We'll post a link to the recording in the next couple of days. And please feel free to share that with your colleagues. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.